Thank you very, very much for the honor of being with you today. I'm deeply inspired by the message from Mrs. Rajavi that we've all just heard, and I don't know what more there is to say after that, but we'll try to do it. I also want to thank you for the tribute to one of my oldest friends and mentors, Senator John McCain, who I have always called my captain, because I met him in 1979 when I was a major in the Marine Corps, and he was a captain in the U.S. Navy and was the head of the Navy Marine Corps Senate Liaison Office on Capitol Hill. And I can tell you that his passing is a national tragedy. We've lost a voice for freedom, for tenacious devotion to freedom, but it's a message that will live long amongst all of us because of the power of his message and the strength of his convictions. Ladies and gentlemen, over the years, I've had the frequent privilege of addressing members of the Iranian American community whose friendship and goals I treasure and value. Sharing time with you is always a very special opportunity, and I deeply appreciate your hospitality and our common interest for a more peaceful, more prosperous future for Iran, the Iranian people, the Middle East, and the world over. Today, as was the case in 2010 when I left my post as National Security Advisor, the Iranian regime remains mankind's most existential threat to peace and stability. I use the word existential because it strikes very much at our collective existence by its unrelenting behavior to undermine our values, our freedom, and our prosperity. You know the role and the roll call of infamy better than I do. It's a regime that seriously violates human rights, UN Security Council resolutions, and international law. It's a regime that artfully dodges its commitments while generating international friction to tighten its grip on its people. People like you, people like your friends and your relatives, wherever they live, and especially the people of Iran. It's a regime that rejects the right of Israel to exist and continues to actively undermine the Middle East peace process with no sign whatsoever of letting up. And Tehran remains the chief antagonist of democracy and liberalization across the Middle East, where a better future for millions of people still struggles to emerge. And we see the regime's aspirations of regional hegemony graphically on display in countries like Syria, Yemen, and Iraq. In Yemen, it hopes to keep the Gulf community embroiled in Shia-Sunni conflict, and in Syria to preserve its proxy state as a permanent base for regional troublemaking and international terror. Among Tehran's most coveted objectives is establishing a long-desired land bridge from Tehran to Beirut via Iraq, and Syria as a platform for spreading its radical ideology by force and intimidation, including through the regime's military and financial support of Hezbollah and other terrorist enterprises, and its collusion with Russia has not gone unnoticed. The United States, in concert with our friends and allies in the regions, must do everything necessary to prevent these territorial ambitions from being realized. If the regime succeeds, the strategic implications will be grave, and the Middle East is sure to remain a hotspot of instability and conflict for many, many more years. The result will be more death and suffering, more destruction, the kind that the regime and its proxies have been inflicting across the region in its fight against Sunnis, the West, the ideals of freedom, and, yes, its own people. It will strengthen the regime's hand in repressing the voice of freedom inside and outside of Iran, including through violence like the evil inflicted on the refugees of Camp Ashraf and Camp Liberty in Iraq, which ultimately resulted in 140 deaths, 7 abductions, and more than 1,300 wounded. This, ladies and gentlemen, we cannot accept. We must no longer accept it. Passivity and weakness in the face of this tyrannical regime has no place in our policies and in our governments. I will always deeply regret that despite our efforts, the United States did not act with greater speed and commitment on behalf of the Ashraf and Liberty refugees. The outrageous delay in coming to their aid resulted in innocent loss of life, and frankly, I regard the chapter as a glaring and I hope atypical failure in America's leadership of the international human rights movement. All of this despite overwhelming evidence of Iran's crimes against humanity. As a longtime advocate for their protection and humanitarian resettlement, along with my friends here today, I'm of course relieved that the refugees were finally relocated out of harm's way to Albania, albeit too late. The administration's signing in 2016 was a welcome gesture, but too late. What happened for the preceding 8 years when very few effective measures of bringing solace and freedom to these people were advocated? However, let's not kid ourselves. The challenges are not relegated to the past. Resettlement in Albania and other locations has brought new obstacles. Let me be clear. The international community is deeply grateful to Albania for opening its arms to resettlement, but the Iranian regime has stepped up its presence and plots in Albania and elsewhere, hoping to harm these dissidents who wish to see a free Iran. In March, Albanian authorities arrested 2 Iranian agents. We can well imagine from past experience about their designs. Additionally, Albania's capacity to provide proper care and support is somewhat limited. The population lacks sufficient financial support, health care, and proper legal status, and it does not yet enjoy the right of a lasting home. Of the 1,900 refugees that were resettled in 2016, as of early 2017, only 41 had achieved proper refugee status. So we must do what's necessary to ensure that the dissidents, having survived the depredations of the regime and its proxies in Iraq, are not made to become subject of the Iranian regime's plots in Albania. And of course, the regime is keeping up its efforts to silence dissidents elsewhere. In June, a terror plot against the annual gathering of the Iranian opposition in Paris was thwarted. And just last month, U.S. law enforcement arrested 2 Iranian spies surveilling and gathering intelligence on members of the pro-democracy opposition in this country, as Mrs. Rajavi pointed out. These are not just some actions of a regime that knows that it is out of step with modernity and fearful of those with a vision and a plan for a better future. As you know, I've been privileged to be a part of a large group of former and current U.S. civilian and military leaders advocating for their rights and welfare, and we will continue to do so. This includes everyone here today at the front table, but I have to say that I'm very proud that it also includes the President's National Security Advisor, John Bolton, who has remained steadfast in his support. You might have noticed that I use that designation regime quite deliberately and often. I try to never use it interchangeably with the name Iran. Iran, after all, is a proud and historic culture and society. It's the homeland of a great and accomplished people. And Iran will endure far beyond any regime, much less this one, that fails to honor its people's hopes and aspirations. I assert this with total conviction and the special distinction of belonging at one point on the regime's most wanted list, something I consider a great honor. I assert this with total conviction and the special distinction of being on that list. Who wouldn't be proud to be regarded as an outlaw by the brute mentality that has worked so hard to snuff out reform in Iran, which has arrested and executed innocent Iranian people for daring to speak out, which has turned its back on universal pleas for reform, and that remains the chief antagonist of democracy and liberalization, not just in Iran, but everywhere it is struggling to develop. Fed up, the people of Iran have taken to the streets in what Secretary of State Pompeo described as, quote, the most enduring and forceful protest since 1979, unquote. In typical fashion, the regime has imprisoned thousands. Several dozens have died since these protests began at the beginning of this year. But the repression will not still the courage and passions of the people demanding the right to liberty and a government worthy of its hopes and dreams. And this is why the protests have continued in a very organized way and with clear purpose, which is to free the Iranian people. Now, as Mrs. Rajavi pointed out, we know that Iran is suffering deep economic pain. The rial has collapsed, inflation has topped 70%. Some will point to the sanctions, old and new, as the culprit, but ladies and gentlemen, the true culprit is the regime that rejects the international norms of behavior on which orderly relations, global trade, and economic engagement are based. So I think it's fair to say that good intentions and an abiding sense of hope was a catalyst for the Iran nuclear deal at its inception, albeit somewhat naive. While the Trump administration's decision to withdraw the United States from the accord was not without some controversy, I think it was the correct measure. Could Tehran really, truly have been surprised given the lack of trust produced by its relentless reception, history of noncompliance, and deadly support of terrorism across the globe? In framing U.S. policy ahead, including the oil sanctions to be imposed later this autumn, measures that I would add are already working, Secretary Pompeo articulated a simple but compelling goal. Quote, our efforts, he said, is to one day see Iranians in Iran enjoying the same quality of life that Iranians in America enjoy. Achieving that vision is deeply rooted in Mrs. Miriam Rajavi's aspirations. It's the core of her 10-point plan for Iran's future. These are Jeffersonian principles that every freedom-loving member of the human race can embrace and that every form of tyranny fears. We all know what those 10 points are, and I will not belabor the point, except to say that, that these 10 principles, as I refer to them as really truly Jeffersonian principles, this is what the regime fears the most. And we look forward with great anticipation to the day when its fears are realized in full. The United States and our allies have a vital role to play in helping shape the kind of free and democratic future that the 10-point plan promises. Mankind's obligation to the people of Iran are far from over. What better place than right here at the UN General Assembly Week to reflect on these obligations and to encourage our leaders to embrace in the United States and throughout the world to meet them. To that end, I think we should focus on 5 strategic imperatives. 1, maintain a constant, vigorous eye on the regime's activities in the nuclear and missile domain. We must remember that the strategic objective is not the imposition of sanctions for sanctions' sake. Rather, it's to stop Iran from obtaining a nuclear capability, period. Point 2, we should remain focused on a just outcome in Syria, a humanitarian tragedy which has sadly fallen out of the news cycle as a key issue. Nothing would strengthen Tehran more than to maintain Syria as a proxy. 3, support the Gulf community in its aspirations to create a defensive alliance to check the regime's existential threat and counter the armed Islamic extremist groups it supports. 4, reinvigorate the Middle East peace process. And 5, though not least, to support the Iranian people who hunger for democracy and a government worthy of their hopes and dreams. So that's the future we are entering. That's the future we're entering, ladies and gentlemen, the future that should serve as a warning to the regime and tell them, your days are numbered. Not because of the condemnation and resolve of the international community that will insist on Iran's compliance with international law. They are numbered because your people will not stop in their demand for a government that reflects their hopes, their dreams, and their aspirations. Their fulfillment rests on the establishment of united, principled, courageous, and organized civic opposition, one that can touch people's heart and minds, one that can harness their passion and conviction to ensure not only that spring returns to Iran, but that spring blossoms into an enduring season of peace and prosperity. That day will come soon. Of this I'm certain. That day will come soon when all Iranians will be set free, when all who are forced to flee their homeland to avoid persecution will lead a great parade in Tehran to celebrate the triumphant return of a great people to their rightful position among the family of nations. That is a future worth creating. Thank you very much.
Thank you, General James Jones.